The first major mass application of IQ testing in the United States and much of the Western world happened when people were being mass enlisted into the army in World War I. So imagine the army has a problem where there are hundreds of thousands of new recruits. Right? All these people are signing up for the war effort. Maybe they want to help out. Maybe they're being conscripted. What are you going to do with them? Okay, who goes where? A group of psychologists adapted the IQ tests that had been developed at the time for this purpose, right? For the purpose of personnel selection, assignment in World War I. And those psychologists included Robert Yerkes and Lewis Terman. So these tests were applied to 2 million soldiers. And there were two versions. There's the alpha and the beta tests that depended on whether or not the person could read, because at this time, illiteracy rates were much higher than they are today. The results were used to place people into certain roles. So there's an idea that if you had the test said very high intelligence, then this person should be a high officer. They should be making big decisions. There's an idea that if somebody has low intellect, then maybe if it's not too low, you can order them around, right? They could be decent soldiers, but maybe they're slow learners, and they're short on initiative. They need a lot of supervision and direction. And maybe somebody's intelligence could be so low that you would say they're, maybe not fit for regular service. Maybe they're the cannon fodder. I wonder what development battalion means. Men whose mental inferiority justifies their recommendation for development battalion. Special service organization. I wonder what they do. Or rejection or discharge. That might be a better option for them. These tests detected ethnic differences in intelligence. They showed that recent immigrants in particular had markedly lower scores. And the assumption was of the psychologists who had developed the test was, oh, okay, these are intellectually inferior races. And they brought their eugenics into that, right? They said, oh no one of us can afford to ignore the menace of race deterioration, because if you allowed immigration from these countries, what's going to happen? There's going to be part of the population. There's going to be miscegenation. Maybe they'll bring down the average intelligence of the nation. So better come up with some policies to stop that. And so this work was used to support a national origins formula, an immigration policy that basically kept America Anglo and white. Those results were eventually found to reflect something called acculturation. You'll remember that crystallized intelligence reflects your knowledge of facts. Okay, I'll give you an example of an IQ test question that I saw that measured crystallized intelligence. And the question was, where does the Pope live? And the multiple choice options were London, Rome, Vatican City, and Paris, and New York. And could there be bias there? Are there some people who are more likely to have that kind of knowledge of things that you would think are common knowledge, but is that knowledge really only unique to certain groups? Are Catholics more likely to know that? Are people who go to school more likely to know that? What about people from parts of the world where, let's say, they're Muslim, not Catholic? Do they know about who the Pope is and where the Pope lives? Like, do you know where the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, who he is and where he lives? Could you guess out of fairly similar multiple choice options? Maybe not. So here's an example of a question like that they used on that test that produced those results. There's a question about Velvet Joe. There were ads that were common at the time for certain kind of cigarette, Velvet cigarettes, and their mascot was Velvet Joe. And so they're thinking, you know, if you have any intelligence, you've been around, you've seen these ads, you should know that Velvet Joe appears in advertisements of tobacco. But what if you're a new immigrant and you're really not paying attention to that? Maybe you're not reading the magazines where you see these advertisements. Can you see the bias? And can you see the major social implications of that bias? After the war, IQ tests came to be used in job selection in the workplace. There is a field of psychology called industrial organizational psychology that's about doing these kinds of assessments and trying to select the right people for the job. IQ score is a pretty decent predictor of job performance. The combination of IQ score and the personality trait of conscientiousness, which is about your work ethic and diligence and attention to detail, is an even better predictor of job performance. And it's actually a much stronger predictor of job performance than many measures that we do use, like job interview performance. The correlation between performance on a job interview, most job interviews, there's some better and worse job interviews, but generally speaking, overall, the correlation between job interview performance and performance on the actual job is very low. I'm sure there's times in your life where you bombed an interview and then did really well on the job, right? Or where you did, you know, ace the interview and then didn't know what you were doing on the job. Today, you might encounter an IQ test if, say, you did a psychoeducational assessment with a psychologist to understand what your cognitive skills are, what your strengths and weaknesses are, so that you can get accommodations you need and play to your strengths. The most commonly used IQ test for adults is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and it has 15 subtests. I'm not asking you to learn what these are. I just want you to know that they're looking at different kinds of cognitive skills. Right? They're looking at, you know, digit span tasks. They're looking at your sort of ability to understand symbols. They're looking at nonverbal intelligence. They're looking at verbal intelligence. So they're looking at a few different types of cognitive skills, but obviously these 15 subtests can't cover every kind of cognitive skill that humans have. I've given you a couple of examples of IQ test questions that weren't really culture fair. The question about Velvet Joe and the question about the Pope. Those could be biased. People from certain cultures may know that, whereas people from other cultures who have equal cognitive powers don't happen to know that. The most culture fair IQ tests are those tests of performance IQ, right, of the nonverbal ones. They don't depend on language. So here's an example of a test of performance IQ called Raven's progressive matrices. This will test your fluid or your performance intelligence, the nonverbal type of intelligence. Can any of you guess what the correct answer is? Noah says 6. Noah, why did you pick 6? I mean, why isn't it 3?
Is it fine if I just speak? Because typing out takes a long time.
Yeah, go for it. Why did you choose that one?
So I chose 6 because if you look, there's a diagonal, a straight, then a diagonal, then a straight diagonal, then diagonal. I mean, it needs to be a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's it goes from 1, 2, then 3 lines, and then the shape missing is a circle. So number 6 meets all the criteria. It's a circle, 3 straight lines.
That is correct. And that is a test of how quickly you can notice those patterns and think on your feet. And we should be able to do this test with hunter-gatherer as well, and have that be a reasonable approximation of his cognitive powers as well as yours. You are most likely to encounter something similar to an intelligence test if you apply for graduate school. In some other countries, like the United States, they have something called, they have aptitude tests for getting into university. So in the United States, students take the SAT, Scholarly Aptitude Test, and that's part of the admissions process. We don't do that in Canada. However, in graduate schools, you will run into something called the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination. If you try to get into medical school, you'll run into the MCAT. If you try to get into law school, you'll run into the LSAT. And sometimes these tests can be quite domain specific. So when I applied for psychology grad school, I had to take the psychology GRE in addition to the general GRE. And the scores on those tests correlate quite highly with IQ tests, right? 0.7, 0.8, those are high correlations. And I remember noticing that in my own scores because I've had my IQ tested, seeing how closely they mapped on. However, this is a test that you can learn. If you need to take the LSAT or the MCAT or the GRE, there are plenty of guidebooks out there that will teach the test to you. Reliability is an important issue in any kind of psychological testing. If a measure is reliable, assuming that whatever you're measuring hasn't actually changed, you should get the same measure repeatedly. It shouldn't be wildly fluctuating. However, psychological tests have, generally speaking, much lower reliability than tests that you'd use in other sciences, right, in harder sciences. You might be given the same IQ test questions twice, and maybe the first time you get it and the second time you're thinking about something else, your memory's blocked and you're stumped. So this is an issue when we want to study whether people's IQ is changing over time. You can ask the question, if you get an IQ score of, let's say, 100 now, will it be the same in 20 years, in 30 years? How does a child's IQ test correlate with their score as an adult? And can you see how the issue of retest reliability kind of threatens that? And so we would want to do this study in a large sample of people because these reliability issues kind of can average out. So you have a large sample. For some people, the test was reliable. For some few other people, it gave them a much lower score than it should have the second time. For some other people, I gave them a much higher score the second time than it should have. But these errors should average out when you have a large enough sample. We do know that but generally speaking, after like age 16, IQ scores are quite stable in adults, but that differs for verbal or crystallized IQ versus the nonverbal performance or fluid IQ. Okay, the fluid IQ peaks in young adulthood and then drops quite precipitously. So older adults are kind of slower to learn, slower on the uptake. There's that saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's probably about fluid IQ declining with age. However, the verbal intelligence, your knowledge of facts, your crystallized intelligence, that can even increase with age. We know that intelligence tests that are done very early in life are very poor predictors of adult IQ. So if it looks like a 6-month-old baby is behind on something, don't panic. you can imagine that we need to use different kinds of tests with babies. Maybe a whole different deal. You can't like hand them a questionnaire with all these multiple choice questions. They can't do that. So what do they do? Well, you could make the assumption that a smarter baby will habituate more quickly to a stimulus that's unimportant or repeated. So that could be used as a measure. You could reason or assume that a smarter baby should be interested in new things and then use that as a measure. However, those measures have low correlations, non-zero, but low correlations with measures of intellectual ability as the child gets older and grows up. What about the validity of IQ scores? Do these scores on these tests actually predict important outcomes? Does it mean something if I tell you that Johnny has an IQ of 80 versus if I told you Johnny has an IQ of 140, or is that all just garbage? IQ tests for all the subjectivity, for all the controversy, are decently valid. They are moderately successful at predicting important outcomes. There is a correlation of 0.5 between IQ scores and grades in school. That means that IQ predicts 25%. So I'm going to square the 0.5. 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25. 25% of the variance in grade. That's not everything. Obviously, other things matter. Obviously, how much you care, how hard you work, whether you actually do the work, all matter. But a chunk of it comes down to raw intellectual ability. As I've mentioned, they're a much better job performance predictor than job interviews are. They do predict health-related outcomes. So people with higher IQs tend to end up with better health, and that might be a health literacy thing. Taking care of your health involves, reading the ingredients on packages and understanding nutrition facts and navigating systems and knowing where to go with your concern. There's all kinds of cognitive skills that come along with that. Maybe with understanding, even talking to a doctor to communicate your problem the right way so that you get the right diagnosis and the right prescription and understand how you need to comply with it. Is it all because of, let's say, poverty? These relationships hold up even when social class is accounted for. So as controversial, as dangerous, and subjective as IQ tests are, they're also one of the greatest achievements in psychology. And they're not, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. IQ scores are approximately normally distributed in the population. What does that mean? It means that most people have an average score. The average IQ is 100. It's set to be that way. Whatever the average score is, we call that's 100. And the standard deviation is 15. And what that means is that about something like 68% of people have IQ scores that are the mean plus or minus 15, plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So fall between like 85 and 115. 95% of people will have IQ scores that fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So 130 would be at 2 standard deviations above. And then almost everyone, 99.7, will have scores that fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. So as scores get more and more extreme, there's a lower and lower frequency of people who have those scores. Okay, a lower and lower probability that a randomly selected person would have a score that high. You can see at the high end, there's a smoother drop. So this is not a perfectly normal distribution, it's approximately normal. But on the lower end, it looks like there's some kind of a baby bell. And there's speculation about what that might be. And it might be because people, in cases where there's really low IQ scores, it's often not a matter of heredity. Sometimes it's because there's a mishap, right? That maybe there's birth complications, maybe there's an injury. So there's more going on than the simpler influences of heredity environment that you'd see at the high end. Okay, more accidents, more birth complications, more unexpected genetic mutations could result in really low IQ than in really high IQ. Right? Most genetic mutations do not work out and end up in spontaneous abortions of a fetus, rather than being some trait that really works for the organism. What about intellectual disability? It's a little bit more subjective than you might expect. It's not just saying, the person has an IQ score that falls below a certain level, right? Like below, say, 70. Not all definitions are the same. We'll talk about this later, but most folks with intellectual disabilities are male. That is actually also true on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are 4 levels: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. In the past, there were different terms. In the past, the terms were idiot, imbecile, and moron. Okay. However, because intelligence is such a socially valued characteristic, there's a euphemism treadmill. And it doesn't really matter what word you use, it will eventually become offensive. The term retarded was at one time a euphemism because it says, okay, they're slow, but they'll get there. But it always becomes a playground insult. And so I wouldn't be surprised if just because of ableism in society, that intellectual disability becomes an insult at some point. As I've mentioned, the more severe the intellectual disability, the less likely it is to run in families, because the more likely it is to be due to some type of environmental catastrophe. There are many, many different causes and kinds of intellectual disability. You're probably familiar with Down syndrome, which is chromosomal trisomy. Fragile X syndrome is another genetic disorder, and it has to do with an X-linked recessive inheritance. Okay, so these are genetic issues. At one time, folks with intellectual disabilities were really treated very poorly, and maybe they would have been institutionalized and pulled out of society, okay, and really left to rot. But things have come a long way since then, not only but partly because of legislation that supports the human rights of people with disabilities, and now we're seeing more efforts at mainstreaming. So now you might find a student with an intellectual disability in the classroom with other kids, but they're doing a type of work that's appropriate for their level. They're not doing what everyone else in the class is doing, but they're still participating, and other students get to see that they're a normal part of society, and not just have them pulled away and sort of put somewhere else where you don't see them. And people with intellectual disabilities can be successfully mainstreamed into the workforce. It's just about having the right accommodations and having a task that suits them. Now, what about the other extreme? Okay, we're looking at kind of the bottom end of the distribution. Now look at the top end of the distribution of IQ scores. People who are mentally gifted are more likely to have occupations where they have to do a lot of complex reasoning. So either be engineers or doctors. There is a mad scientist stereotype. However, Terman's long-term study of intellectually gifted children who came from different places, they weren't all, let's say, very, very rich kids. he had a pretty decent broad sample, found that they were not more likely to crash and burn. They were not more likely to have mental illness than the comparison. Heredity has a role in the development of intellectual giftedness, of course. However, so does environment, right? So does having really good education. So does having a lot of resources and the ability and the freedom and the interest in learning. There is a graph in your textbook that shows the IQ scores for different occupations. And what they're showing there is percentiles. So green is the 10th percentile. It says, where's the bottom 10%? Blue is the median. In a normal distribution, the median and the mode are the same. So it's the middle, right? Where's the average? It's the 50th percentile. And then the 90th percentile says, like, what's the score for people who are in the top 90%? Right, of whom only 10% have a higher score then. So we look at the blue, you can see that there are differences across, there are differences across professions. And medical doctors seem to have the highest average IQ. And I'm glad. I hope I have a very smart doctor, and I love that. However, you can see that there is substantial overlap, and that there are very smart people who choose or end up being, say, custodial workers. Oh, here's something funny. So if you look at, they have police officers there. Yeah, well, they have law enforcement. And you can see that, well, okay, it's the average is a little bit lower than for, say, doctors or professors. There was actually a case in the United States, like I guess it was some kind of a discrimination case, where a man was rejected after he applied to be a police officer, despite having all the qualifications and despite getting a really high score on the IQ test, because it was determined that his IQ was too high. Okay, the psychologists who had come up with the hiring standards had decided that there's sort of an ideal range of IQ score for police officers, and it shouldn't be too high because there's a lot of routine work, and somebody with a really high IQ could get bored. And so he was rejected for having too high of an IQ, and the courts actually upheld that. Okay. As I've said, there are hereditary influences on IQ. IQ is about 70% heritable. That's more heritable than personality is, which is about 50%. And we see that in twin studies, right? So we do see that it runs in families. Identical twins who are raised apart in different environments tend to come out with similar IQ scores. That said, environment matters a lot too. We would certainly see a strong affective environment where there's a lot of deprivation. So if somebody is raised with no formal education, a very deprived environment, a lot of, let's say, lack of stimulation, poor nutrition, obviously that could have quite a profound effect. So environmental deprivation can override the effects of genes on intelligence. Amount of schooling seems to matter as well. Like there's a correlation between grades and IQ, and maybe grades that also reflects a role of learning and education. There is a lot of scientific controversy regarding the impact of breastfeeding on IQ. I think a lot of people have a stake in this debate, probably all the formula companies. There's a lot of mom guilt about this too. It does look like overall breast is best. You're not ever really going to be able to come up with an infant formula that has like every micronutrient, every antibody, everything that is in mother's milk. That said, bottle-fed babies grow up to be very smart, and the difference is not that large. It's of a few IQ points, maybe 5. That won't have a huge difference in somebody's life. There were efforts at early intervention programs, especially from kids from deprived environments, like Head Start, to try to see if having that kind of enriched environment as preschoolers could result in long-term effects on IQ. It's really hard to do that kind of study. It's really hard to study the same group of people for 20 or 30 years. And there's research that suggests that had really good effects. There's research that suggests that it didn't. It's hard to do. We do know that there's some small effect of expectancy effects by teachers on the IQ or the grades of students. So in this experiment that's described in your textbook, the researchers select students who have the same tested IQ, and then they tell some of the teachers that these are really bright sort of students. Maybe they'll be a late bloomer, but you can expect great things from this child. And then maybe other ones are told not to have those expectations. The teachers end up treating the students differently, really encouraging and responding to the ones that they're told are more gifted, and then those kids end up actually having higher scores, maybe as a result of the environment. So the environment still matters. Poverty and deprivation is associated with lower IQs. That could be the direction of the causality could work 2 ways. So we know that more deprived environments, poor nutrition, often more exposure to pollutants like lead can result in lower IQ scores. However, folks with lower IQ who may have children with lower IQs are also more likely to end up being poor, because they might, they'll have more difficulty finding or maintaining employment. It's probably not going to be high paid employment. Okay, so it could be going 2 ways there. There are differences globally in average IQ scores. So the poorest country is Somalia. And in Somalia, many people aren't getting access to basic education or to good food or to medicine. And as you might expect, so the average IQ is 67. You can see an association here in this graph right off the bat that richer countries have higher IQ scores. As I've mentioned before, the IQ score of 100 is not an absolute value. There is a test. There's a number of items on the test. There's the percent that people get right. But that average score is what 100 means. And that true average performance is not stable. It's actually getting higher and higher. It rises for about 3 points every 10 years, and that could be reflecting better nutrition, better access to education. Maybe it reflects the fact that people are having fewer children, and so each child gets more attention. Maybe we're getting simply better at writing tests. There's more people going to school and taking tests than there was, let's say 80 years ago, and the IQ test was the first test and only test someone was only given in their life. There are some sex differences in IQ. You can see there's 2 different distributions there. And the pink distribution is the distribution of IQ scores for people of the female sex, and the blue distribution is that of people of the male sex. How are these distributions different? How are they similar? Compare and contrast. Yeah, it says, as Liam says, more males in the tails. The average is in the same place. Okay, it's 100 for both. But you can see that the female distribution has a higher peak there. Okay, it sort of says there's relative to males, there's more females with an average IQ score. There's more spread in the male distribution. So let's look, there's more spread such that there's more males in the tails. There's more males with very low scores, and there's more males with very high scores. So let's look at a point here on the x-axis that would be a really low IQ score. I don't know what it would be. Maybe it'd be something like 70. Oh, I need to turn my laser pointer on so you guys know what I'm looking at. Sorry. Okay. So let's look at this point. Maybe that's an IQ of 70. Can you see there'd be this percentage of females with that score, whatever that would correspond to on the y-axis. And can you see how many times more males there are with that same low score? And we see the same thing on the high end, such that at the really extremely high scores, it might be 13 males to 1 female. Why might that be? We could be evolutionary psychologists and speculate. Some evolutionary psychologists speculate that females who are sort of choosy maters and say no a lot to men and select the men who they think are the most maybe genetically fit, are kind of like the lifeguards at the gene pool. And so that nature creates a kind of more diversity in a certain skill in males. So you see like a kind of a wider range perhaps. And then that allows the female to kind of select out of that what is working best in the environment. That's one thought. However, there's no way to prove that. And, that is speculation from a pop psychology book. There are sex differences in terms of specific mental abilities as well. Female people tend to have higher verbal IQ scores. They tend to be better at recognizing emotions in others. And males tend to do better on spatial ability tests, like rotating an object mentally. So here's an example of a mental rotation question. So here's the object, and the question is, which one of these 4 is the rotated version of that specific object? I can't answer that question. I don't know. But maybe there's one among you that's like, I don't know, which is the correct answer? I don't know. It's 4, says Annabelle. I can't tell you if that's right or wrong because I'm very bad at spatial stuff. Noah says it's 3. Again, I couldn't tell you the right answer, but that is what an object rotation question looks like, and you'll find them on IQ tests. This could be a reason that, you find more males in sort of STEM fields like engineering. Okay, that's one thought. There is an influence of testosterone on spatial ability, and men, the part of the brain that deals with spatial things tends to be larger in males. But there's still tons of overlap, right? These are not huge differences. So, maybe some of these differences are biological, maybe they come down to the effects of hormones. I suspect it is hormones because these environmental differences, these differences tend not to be seen in small children, but they come up at puberty. Alternatively, maybe it's something about training and learning. Maybe men are trained to solve problems in a certain way, to think about things visually. I don't know if that's true or not, but there is research saying that if you can train women to think in this more spatial way, they can get better at this kind of spatial problem solving. There are also ethnic differences in IQ. The overlap between these distributions is substantial. However, there are some differences in the average. What do we mean by, ethnicity? Ethnicity ultimately refers to communities. So let's say you're comparing the difference in average IQ scores in an American sample between white Americans and Asian Americans. Asian Americans tend to have higher average IQ scores. Well, is that because of something genetic or biological? Maybe, but there's also an Asian American community, and communities have different social values, and they differ in their access to resources. Some communities have a lot more resources than others, right? Some communities are relatively materially deprived. Some communities face suppression. And cultural values differ. Like in some communities, there's a huge emphasis on education. Right? A lot of Asian American kids are under tremendous pressure from their parents to do really well in school. A lot of Jewish culture seems to really value and prize education. And a lot of, Jewish kids get that pressure from their parents and their communities to do really well in school and get a professional degree. I just noticed a question in the chat that's interesting, and it's about the sex differences in IQ scores. And the question is, have people ever tried testing transgender people and comparing the statistics to cisgender people of the same gender? Like, would trans women have answers more similar to cis women or cis men? I'm broadly aware that brain research or research on abilities in LGBT folks tends to find that their abilities fall between what's the average for cisgender, heterosexual males and females. The textbook takes a view that the differences in the average differences in IQ scores between ethnic groups are largely or completely environmental in origin. And indeed, as differences in environmental conditions decrease, we see differences decreasing. That said, within any particular ethnic group, like let's say within Jewish people, within Caucasian people, there's still within group variances, right? There's always people who fall at the average, people who fall far below average, and people who fall far above averages. So there's within group differences, and then there's between group differences. There's a question of whether these differences are due to test bias, and it seems like the answer is generally, most evidence points to say no. It's not due to test bias. What do we mean by test bias? That's a question of how well the test predicts outcomes for different groups. So in this example from your textbook, you see that the IQ score is correlated with grades or GPA for white respondents. So it's for white respondents in this example, IQ scores are predicting grades. However, they're not predicting grades for Asian respondents in this example. I don't know if this is real data or fake data or made up, but either way, it's showing that it's predicting something in one group but not the other. And if this is real data, we would say, okay, this test does have a bias such that it doesn't work, it doesn't predict outcomes for Asian respondents. That's what we mean by test bias. However, it actually seems that IQ tests predict outcomes in a reasonably valid way for all ethnic groups that are being tested. So that's why we don't think it's test bias. It could be social bias, right? There could be an oppressive social force that is creating, these low IQ scores in a group, but then it's not the test's fault, it's society's fault. Your textbook gives you an example of understanding these, how the environment could impact and impact IQ scores between groups such that you would have a difference when it's really about environment. And they give you an example of group 1 and group 2 plants in this case. They're making about plants and height. And these plants really have the same average height. There's some variance within the group, but on average, same kind of height. And we give sunlight and, and water to some plants and not to others, or less to others, resulting in, at the end of the day, what seems to be an average difference in height. Something I noticed here is that the source is Lewontin from 1970. Further remarks on race and the genetics of intelligence. The strong proponents of environmental origins tend to cite Lewontin a lot. Lewontin did his genetic research a very long time ago, and population genetics has come a very long way in what is like 50 years. And so Lewontin is actually a sort of controversial figure in science. However, I do notice that he tends to be cited very authoritatively in intro psych textbooks when they're taking the kind of harder line environmental approach. From what, I'm not a population geneticist, like that's not really my area. I was trying to sort of inform myself. I was reading about research in genetics, and it looks like, there are strong hereditary factors in intelligence. So you can't kind of put it all down to environment, but the environment still does matter. I thought, here's a radical idea. What if we don't need everybody to sort of have the same average cognitive abilities for us to be equal? Like, what if it's really a different kind of political or moral problems? Like, what if there actually were hereditary differences in talents and skills and intellectual abilities between groups? What if there's many different things, right? Talent, skills, intellectual abilities that aren't measured on the test, that aren't one of those 15 things that are measured on the Welchler test. Like, basic survival skills aren't on the test. Right? What if, that hunter-gatherer is like really very intellectually able in ways that are just totally not on that test? Okay, so does the test privilege certain kind of cognitive abilities that work in a certain kind of society? Because I'm sure that there's many people with very high IQ scores that would not be able to survive in his circumstances at all, right? Probably do something foolish and be dead in a day. Right? Wisdom is not on the test. But what if wisdom, which is about balancing self-interest and the interest of those you care about and the interests of society, the interest of of humanity, what if that is really important? Okay, so maybe you could look at let's say Westerners who have high IQ scores. Would they be able to function in that hunter-gatherers environment? Maybe not. Are they doing foolish things that we're not measuring, right? Like, do we have a lack of foresight about the way we're treating the environment, right? Are school grades everything? Okay, what if these different groups evolved over time to solve different problems in different environments, and therefore maybe have an edge on certain skills and maybe are weaker at other things? So, what if there really were different strengths and weaknesses on average, and there's some hereditary component? And if that were true, that doesn't have to be sort of terrible, right? Like, I'd say that on a great team, and we support each other's success, we're aware of our strengths and our weaknesses, and we let people play to their strengths, and we cover for each other's weaknesses. And we might not have to conclude that certain abilities are better and universally more socially valued than others. So sometimes I think that wanting to see everyone as the same on average isn't necessarily the best way to do things. But sometimes I think there's a drive among people who value equality to be like, no, really, we are really all the same. Well, what if we're not? What if we don't have to be? There's a question about stereotype threat. So if, let's say that you're female and you're taking a math test and you've been raised to learn that girls aren't good at math, and maybe this makes you feel stressed. Well, yes, in the lab, you can activate this kind of stereotype threat and then see somewhat lower scores. I think that's a general effect of test anxiety. If I were to give you an exam and find some way to provoke fear and anxiety and low self-esteem in you, it would probably damage your scores a bit. Not tremendously. Textbooks on intelligence often talk about growth mindset. It's Carol Dweck's idea that you shouldn't think of your IQ as fixed, right? Because then maybe you'll take less risks, you won't challenge yourself so much. Maybe you should have this growth mindset and you think that your IQ score is developable, and now you're going to take on more risks and challenges and learn more. In education, there are a lot of theories become popular because they have a feel-good kind of a component to them. Like, you just need to believe in yourself and then you can do anything. A randomized control trial that was carefully done found that training students in this growth mindset didn't actually change their scores in numeracy or literacy at all. So it seemed to have null results, right? Another study found no connection between having this mindset and being able to achieve what you're putting your mind to. So this is not really empirically supported, but it keeps coming up. And I think it ends a chapter where people might feel kind of judged and inadequate on a high note. That's kind of my sense or my idea of why it might be there. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach it. And as you can see from a LinkedIn post I made, I feel quite frustrated sometimes that we keep having these debunked, these unscientific theories in the textbook, but they're a big part of like popular culture and you hear about them. So maybe you might as well know about them. On to creativity. Okay, creativity is, you might think that should be part of an IQ test. I don't think it is. Creativity is about novel and valuable ideas or works of imagination. And it's often used measuring tests of divergent thinking. So a question to test your divergent thinking would be like, how many uses can you think of for a fork? What else could you do with a fork rather than eat food? Okay. Convergent thinking is about finding the single best answer to a problem. When you are answering a multiple choice question and there's 4 options and you're not quite sure which one it is, you're able to rule out the other ones and find the most likely answer. That's convergent thinking. It would be easy to reify the idea of creativity as novel and valuable as something that's very universal, very sort of scientific. It's actually also pretty socially constructed, because here is an amazing work of creativity. Like an Italian artist, Maurizio Cattelan, he taped a banana to a wall. 3 editions of this sold for $120,000 each. There's much talked about, much written about, crowds of people queued to see it. Let's say your kid brother duct tape a banana to a wall. Would your mom be like, so creative? Well, maybe, but it would be seen pretty differently, because what is valuable differs depending on social context. So maybe it's valuable for people at the Guggenheim Art Museum to think about what art is, but it's not valuable to your mom to have duct tape on the wall. What is novel differs depending on social constructs. So what is new to the Guggenheim Museum is not new to mom. Okay, so there's still social constructions there. Another kind of pop psychology concept is emotional intelligence, like that, and there's truth to the idea that there's importance to the ability to understand your own emotions and other people's emotions. But the hard-nosed scientist would say, is this a new construct that we really need? Because it seems that this is simply the combination of standard IQ plus the personality traits of agreeableness and maybe extroversion. Okay, so, and it doesn't predict job performance beyond general IQ. But it's out there, and if you're in the workplace, they'll be training on EI and workshops on it, and so it's a popular idea. However, scientifically, this construct doesn't really add anything new or anything more over the combination of general IQ and desirable personality scores. I'll end on wisdom. Okay, so people have asked, what about grit, which is passion, perseverance in achieving your goals? And what about wisdom? Wisdom is about applying your cognitive skills towards a common good. And ultimately, intelligence is valued because it's supposed to be adaptive behavior. And so you can ask, well, adaptive to whom? To you and your self-interest? Could you support your self-interest in a way that just damages things for your family, for everyone else? Is that really smart? Okay, these are philosophical questions. And so this is a newer area of research in psychology. It's controversial and still not yet widely accepted and still in its early stages. But you can see that there's a lot of controversy, subjectivity in the field of intelligence. And what we learn can be useful and valuable, and we can also do it poorly and cause a lot of harm. Thank you for your patience. I went over time by 6 minutes, and I'll make this recording available to the class for those of you who had to leave. Thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. I'm going to stop the recording here.